Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to call to order this hearing. I'm grateful to be joined by my ranking member, Mr. Tom Cotton, and of course, it's always good to see one of our more senior members in the Senate, Senator Cornyn. All the subcommittee members who are here today, and I know there'll be people coming along, I want to thank them, and I want to thank especially every single witness that's taking time out of their schedule to be here. I called this hearing really to talk about the festering injustice that continues in our nation that I believe has to be addressed. An injustice that stands in contrast to the ideals of equality and liberty, and which cuts at the very heart of what I think are fundamental rights in America today. It's clear now, after decades of evidence, that the federal cannabis prohibition has failed. It has failed to make our communities safer. It's failed to reflect modern science, contemporary values across the political spectrum, and it's miserably failed a lot of our most vulnerable people in America, whether that is our veterans who come home often with challenges seen and unseen, whether it's low-income communities, black and brown communities, and more. And really, it's inflicted a lot of damage upon the families within our country. Each year, more and more states and localities are moving in bipartisan ways to legalize or decriminalize cannabis. Yet federal government continues to be out of step with the majority of the United States of America and our citizens. Today, the federal government considers cannabis as dangerous and medically useless as heroin, prosecuting hundreds of people each year for low-level cannabis offenses. For generations, the federal cannabis prohibition has also been a core piece of a disastrous war on drugs that has targeted and destroyed the lives of so many Americans, particularly vulnerable Americans and communities across our country. For example, data shows that black and white Americans use cannabis at roughly the same rates. Yet studies have shown that black Americans are more than 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession. In 2019, there were more cannabis arrests in the United States than arrests for all violent crimes combined. The focus on arresting low-level, nonviolent cannabis users detracts from law enforcement's priorities that should aim to punish and deter far more dangerous violent crimes. And under the guise of tough-on-crime policies, we have disproportionately arrested millions of black and brown people who are now restricted in their access to jobs, health care, housing, and more opportunities after their release. This country's failed policies have deprived too many of their chance to pursue their life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and has punished their families along with them. On a personal note, I've seen the devastating impacts of our federal cannabis laws have had on people's lives. During my undergraduate years at Stanford, I saw drug use out in the open by privileged Stanford students, which was completely ignored by law enforcement. The story was the same in my hometown of Harrington Park, a relatively affluent community. Yet living in Newark, New Jersey, the last 25 years, I have seen one constant day after another, black and brown people trying to climb out of challenging economic holes they were put in after a cannabis-related arrest or conviction. Remember, we now have a nation where about 3 out of the last 5 United States presidents have talked about their cannabis use. One, we see now clearly that cannabis laws are unevenly enforced and often, unfortunately, devastate the lives of those most vulnerable. It's clear that prohibition has not worked. 50 years after the Controlled Substances Act was passed to stamp out the sale of cannabis on the black market, the illicit market still thrives. And in a clear signal of how outdated current federal laws are on the issue, the Department of Justice chooses not to enforce the federal prohibition on cannabis against people in compliance with their own state's cannabis laws. This is the case now and was even true under Attorney General Bill Barr, someone who literally wrote the book on arguing for more incarceration. Thankfully, even as the federal government lags woefully behind the states themselves are leading the charge for change. As of today, 38 states in the District of Columbia have legalized cannabis for medical use, and 19 states and the District of Columbia have legalized it for recreational adult use. More states are sure to join these ranks in the coming years, as 91% of the American public supports legalizing marijuana, at least for medical use, and 68% support legalization for adult use. These state efforts, which incidentally have led to fewer arrests and decreased racial disparities in those arrests, demonstrate why ending the federal prohibition is appropriate and responsible, and it's a way for our federal government to respond to overwhelmingly clear evidence as well as the clear will of the people. So after years of advocacy, the emergence of a bipartisan consensus and the steady work of bipartisan state legislatures, we find ourselves in a promising moment, and it's up to us to seize it. Last week, I, along with leaders Schumer and Senator Wyden, introduced the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, which would legalize marijuana federally, lift up communities disproportionately impacted by our misguided cannabis policy, and set up a regulated market for cannabis business. It combined critical aspects of restorative justice and economic justice and economic opportunity. It's a type of comprehensive solution we need when it comes to correcting our nation's broken cannabis laws. At this critical juncture, it's time to expand our horizons and not shrink back to a status quo that has caused far too much damage to far too many Americans. Back during my days as a city council person in Newark, New Jersey, I recall a man who had been arrested for cannabis offense a decade ago asking me pointedly, anger and frustration filling his voice, "What is it going to take? It's been over 10 years. What is it going to take for me to get a second chance?" Well, it's going to take all of us, members of this subcommittee and members of this body, coming together to reckon with the injustices of our past that have plagued America and to understand the pain communities, especially communities of color, have felt for years. This is not about Democrat versus Republican or right versus left. America themselves have spoken. This is about what is right and what is wrong. Ending the federal prohibition is the first step that we can take to undo the immeasurable damage caused by the failed war on drugs and decades of mass criminalization, mass incarceration, and the deep pain it's caused to communities and families and our children. It will be a signal that our nation can move forward, that we can make sure that all people are afforded the long overdue justice that they deserve, but have been too long denied. With that, I look forward to hearing from the rest of the subcommittee and from our witnesses today, and I now recognize the senator from Arkansas, Tom Cotton, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The marijuana legalization movement is plagued by misinformation, much of which somehow found it into the chairman's opening statement. So let's start today by examining what we are, and maybe more importantly, what we are not talking about as we examine this legislation, which should be called the Marijuana Reparations Act. First, the legalization movement is not about so-called medical marijuana. Nearly every state in the country already has some sort of state law or program for so-called medical marijuana. Some of those programs are tightly regulated, others are a joke with no guardrails whatsoever. But for 8 years, since 2014, Congress has passed laws that prevent the Department of Justice from interfering in state medical marijuana programs. So this isn't a question of whether someone addicted to fentanyl or in advanced stages of cancer could get marijuana to help with their affliction. Second, the legalization movement is not about banking or financial institutions providing services for these so-called medical marijuana businesses or other marijuana businesses which purport to be operating legally. Despite fear-mongering to the contrary, there is no lack of available banking for marijuana businesses today. According to the Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, there are over 750 banks and credit unions that provide banking services to marijuana businesses that comply with state law. Third, federal marijuana laws are not a racial justice issue, and federal prisons are not filled with low-level, nonviolent drug possessors. Groups like the ACLU misleadingly suggest that Black Americans are disproportionately targeted by federal marijuana laws. But unlike the ACLU, the numbers don't lie. There are very few federal marijuana cases to begin with, barely over 1,000 in 2021, and more than 80% of federal marijuana offenders are white or Latino, and the vast majority of them are caught trafficking in southern border districts. The median penalty for these offenses is only 18 months. Fourth and finally, the legalization movement is not about researching marijuana for potential medical purposes in the future. There is no shortage of marijuana research today. Much of that research is shedding light on the enormous negative health effects of marijuana on the human body. Health effects that include heart problems, brain damage, lung damage, impaired driving, mental health disorders, addiction, and more. The danger for young Americans is especially acute. Recent studies link use of marijuana by young people with a higher likelihood of committing violent crimes and suicide. That's not to say there aren't potential health benefits of marijuana-related chemicals in controlled settings. There are, for example, some drugs that use purified forms of chemicals found in marijuana and are FDA approved and fully legal under federal law for treating things like seizures or cancer patients. But the research continues, and the DEA and the FDA have greatly expanded approvals for marijuana research. So what is this hearing all about? The Marijuana Reparations Act, introduced last week by the chairman and other Democrats, like a similar bill by House Democrats, is not about research or medicine. It's about legalizing and commercializing marijuana nationwide, eliminating federal limits on recreational use, and making marijuana much more easily available to young people, including teenagers. Worse still, the bill would wipe clean the criminal records of illegal alien traffickers, along with gang members. By automatically expunging past marijuana trafficking convictions, it would even result in reduced sentences for repeat criminals who are serving time in federal prison for violent offenses or for trafficking other drugs like cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl. In short, this bill would be an enormous gift to the cartels and the gangs, and in the midst of a nationwide violent crime surge. When these criminals trafficked marijuana, they broke the law. Whether some find that law unfashionable or even unfair, what they did was illegal. There should be consequences, not billions of dollars in grants to apologize for enforcing the law as it is written. After all, why is marijuana illegal under federal law? It's simple. Because it has no accepted medical use, it's dangerous, and it's addictive. And that's not my judgment, or even the DEA's judgment. That's what the FDA found in 2016 during the administration of President Barack Obama. As President Obama's DEA administrator noted in a 2016 letter, and this is a direct quote, "If the scientific understanding about marijuana changes, and it could change, then the decision could change. It certainly would be odd to rely on science when it suits us and ignore it otherwise." I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today.
Thank you, Ranking Member Cotton. I recognize that the chairman of the Judiciary Committee has walked in, Chairman Dick Durbin. I'd like to offer him the courtesy of saying any opening statement he might want to have.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, for today's hearing, which provides a timely, much-needed look at the federal approach to cannabis. There's been a sea change in the way cannabis has been addressed throughout this country. 38 states have now legalized the medical use. District of Columbia and 19 states, including Illinois, have legalized or decriminalized recreational use by adults over age 21. It's clear that like much of the failed war on drugs, the criminal enforcement approach to marijuana regulation has resulted in serious injustice. Long before I was elected to Congress, I was a practicing lawyer in small-town America, Springfield, Illinois, and I can't tell you how many parents discovered the Bill of Rights and the Miranda warnings because of a joint found in the glove compartment of a 16-year-old. We went through a period in our history which I don't want to return to, where people's lives were literally changed because of one indiscretion which did not rank in the criminal category in my mind. Marijuana arrests are the largest single category arrests in the United States. Marijuana arrests annually are larger than the total number of arrests for all violent crimes combined. People suffer all of the consequences of an arrest record and sometimes incarceration, and it's not clear what public health benefit, if any, we're getting from it. We also know there are significant racial disparities in criminal enforcement. Black, Latino, Native Americans are arrested and prosecuted for marijuana offenses at much higher rates than white Americans. despite data indicating that marijuana use is quite similar across all of these groups. That's why it's important that as cannabis production transitions to the legal marketplace, we ensure that groups historically targeted for prosecution should have full opportunity to participate, and we should direct a substantial portion of cannabis tax revenues to programs that aid individuals and communities harmed by the war on drugs. I'm a co-sponsor of 2 bills in this area. The Cannabis and Marijuana Research Expansion Act, introduced by Senator Feinstein, which would encourage scientific and medical research on marijuana and its compounds, including CBD, by removing some of the barriers to research in current federal law. It's important that we understand what conditions can be successfully treated with these compounds, what the appropriate dosing and delivery systems are, and how they interact with other medications. I'm also a co-sponsor of the Safe Banking Act, which would allow financial institutions to offer banking services to legally operated cannabis business without fear of punishment by federal regulators. This bill would reduce the risk of violent crime that these cash-heavy businesses often face, and it would ensure access to capital for what are often small, minority-owned enterprises. As we think about legislating, I want to emphasize 2 other concerns. First, we must ensure that these products are not marketed to children. There should be no Joe Camel of cannabis, and there should be no candy-flavored vaping products on the market. I've been fighting for years with the tobacco companies and their flavored e-cigarettes, and now, frankly, fighting with the FDA with its foot-dragging and getting these kid-friendly smoking products off the shelves. We shouldn't have to fight this battle all over again with cannabis. Second, where cannabis compounds are sold as medicinal products, any health claims have to be real. They should be backed up by solid science, and consumers should know exactly what ingredients are in the products they're putting in their bodies. Today, Americans use cannabis-based products believing they can treat a variety of illnesses. Most of these claims have never been evaluated by the FDA. Cannabis may have great potential as a medicine, but we should commit to ensuring that Americans receive safe and effective treatments they deserve. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses as we examine the best way forward in federal approach to cannabis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin. We really have a distinguished panel of witnesses here. I think that all the senators are looking forward to hearing from them. I'm going to briefly introduce the majority witnesses, then turn to Senator Cotton to introduce the 2 minority witnesses. Then I will administer your oath, and then we'll begin with the opening statements. And so first, a witness is Dr. Malik Burnett. Dr. Burnett is an adjunct professor in addiction medicine at the University of Maryland, where he serves as the chair of the Opioid Task Force. He also serves as medical director for the Maryland Department of Health's Center for Harm Reduction Services, practices in addiction medicine in Baltimore at Medmark Treatment Centers, and serves as a consultant for the Maryland Addiction Consultation Service. He earned his MPH from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and completed his residency training in general preventative medicine at Johns Hopkins Hospital and his addiction medicine fellowship at the University of Maryland Medical Center. Dr. Burnett, thank you very much for being here today and taking time out of your busy set schedule. Our second witness is Chief Edward Jackson, Police Chief of Annapolis, Maryland. Chief Jackson served with the Baltimore Police Department for 21 years, starting as a foot patrolman and eventually rising to colonel, finally retiring as Chief of the Administrative Division. Chief Jackson participated in over 500 misdemeanor and felony arrests and investigated crimes including the most serious: murder, rape, arson, drug distribution, assault, and child abuse. He holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Copen State College, a master's in applied behavioral science with a concentration in community development from Johns Hopkins University, and a PhD in public safety leadership from Capella University. Chief Jackson, thank you for your service. All of us up here know what kind of sacrifice it is to be in law enforcement, especially on dangerous streets, and I'm grateful that you are here. Do you prefer chief or doctor? Okay, sir. And then our final witness is Weldon Angelos, who was a rising star in the music industry, kind of like Senator Dick Durbin. But unlike Senator Durbin, he was convicted of selling marijuana to an informant due to mandatory sentencing laws, was sentenced to a mandatory 55 years in prison without the possibility of early release. Calls for Mr. Weldon's release steadily grew. They were bipartisan calls. He gained the support of Senators Rand Paul and Mike Lee and was eventually pardoned by President Trump in 2020. Since then, he has become a strong advocate for criminal justice reform and ending the federal cannabis prohibition. Mr. Weldon, I thank you for being here as well. It's great to see you. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd first like to welcome Alex Berenson. Mr. Berenson is from New York's Hudson Valley and is the author of the Unreported Truths Substack, over a dozen novels and 3 nonfiction books, including Tell Your Children, The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence, published in 2019. Adaptations of his book have also been published in the Journal of the Missouri State Medical Association. Between 1999 and 2010, Mr. Berenson was a business and investigative reporter for the New York Times, but you should not hold that against him. He focused on the pharmaceutical and healthcare industries. During the Wuhan coronavirus pandemic, he also became known as a critic of non-pharmaceutical interventions, including school closures and lockdowns, continuing to use his investigative reporting skills to report on the scientific data, even when it might not have fit the prevailing media or political narrative. Next, I'd like to welcome Steve Cook. Mr. Cook spent 33 years as a federal prosecutor, from a line prosecutor in Tennessee to eventually becoming Associate Deputy Attorney General, where he was responsible for the department's efforts to reduce violent crime. Mr. Cook also served 3 terms as president of the National Association of Assistant United States Attorneys. Before becoming a prosecutor, Mr. Cook was a police officer for 7 years, serving in nearly every law enforcement capacity. He then earned his law degree from the University of Tennessee with honors and clerked on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Today, Mr. Cook is retired from his federal service, but he continues to advise and represent law enforcement organizations and policymakers. Mr. Chairman, in addition to welcoming these 2 witnesses, I'd also like to take a moment to recognize that we have several guests here today from the group Smart Approaches to Marijuana, which is a bipartisan organization founded to educate citizens on the science and research related to marijuana and marijuana policy. They do exceptional and thought-provoking work, and we're glad to have them here today. I'd also like to ask consent to enter a written statement from their president, Dr. Kevin Sabet, into the record, along with a written statement from the National Association of Assistant United States Attorneys.
Is Dr. Kevin Sabet present today? Well, I want to join Senator Cotton in thanking the citizen activists for being here as well, and without objection, we will enter those for the record. All right, this is the part where you all get to swear at senators. I'd ask you all to please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give before the subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you, gentlemen. You may sit down. You will each have 5 minutes for your opening statement, and we will start with Dr. Burnett.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying my comments today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of my employers. Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, members of the Subcommittee on Criminal Justice and Counterterrorism, it is a privilege to testify before you today as a representative of the overwhelming majority of Americans who believe that the United States should end the failed policy of cannabis prohibition. My name is Dr. Malik Burnett, and I'm a practicing physician in the city of Baltimore, where I care for patients suffering from a wide range of substance use disorders and work on establishing public health strategies to reduce the harms caused by our nation's opioid overdose crisis. In addition to my work as a physician, throughout my career, I've provided testimony on the international, federal, state, and local level about various topics in drug policy, assisted in the development of cannabis legislation across a wide range of jurisdictions, experienced firsthand the litany of challenges associated with starting a business in the cannabis space, especially as a person of color, and navigated bureaucratic roadblocks associated with conducting research on the medical applications of the cannabis plant. However, today I come before you to engage in a discussion of the legislative strategies needed to end the federal policy on cannabis prohibition and restore communities most harmed by the war on drugs. Since previously testifying before this legislative body just over 3 years ago, it unfortunately remains an unmitigated fact that the state of cannabis policy today is best described as a tale of 2 Americas, where the wealthy, white, and well-connected are able to consume cannabis, start companies, create jobs, amass significant personal wealth, and generate billions in tax revenue for states with sanctioned cannabis programs, while the poor, the marginalized, and people of color are arrested for merely possessing the plant and subject to the collateral consequences associated with criminal conviction. Fortunately, over the same time period, many states have proactively attempted to address these inequalities by passing thoughtful cannabis policy focused on promoting social equity in cannabis commerce and restorative justice in the criminal legal system. Additionally, numerous bills have been introduced in Congress which attempt to address the panoply of harms associated with cannabis conviction that have been selectively enforced and aimed at Black and Latinx communities for decades. These harms include but are not limited to arrest, incarceration, loss of employment, housing, financial aid eligibility, child custody, and immigration status. Furthermore, no federal legislation to date has been more comprehensive in addressing and removing the aforementioned collateral consequences and restoring the communities most harmed than the recently introduced Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. One need look no further than the findings outlined at the beginning of the CAOA to understand the need for reform. The annual wasting of $3.6 billion taxpayer dollars in an effort to enforce prohibition of what has consistently been reported as the most widely used illicit substance since the creation of the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, with racial bias and mass incarceration as the only receipts the nation has to show for the misappropriation of these funds, it is clear that change is needed. In 2020, over 350,000 citizens were arrested for cannabis, which is the equivalent of one arrest every 90 seconds. 90% of these arrests are for simple possession. People of color are 4 times more likely to be arrested despite equal use of cross-race. Black men receive 13.1% longer sentences for the same crime as their white counterparts, and Latino men are 6.5 times more likely to receive a federal sentence for cannabis possession than their non-Hispanic whites. I appeal to you, senators, today. Let us not waste the precious time of the committee debating thoroughly debunked and discredited ideas such as the gateway hypothesis, which the Institute of Medicine debunked in a report in 1999. The data from the biannual National Survey on Drug Use and Health routinely disproves this idea, as the rates of cannabis use have increased steadily over the past decades, while rates for use of all other substances have remained the same or declined. Let us not engage in debates around whether ending the federal prohibition on cannabis will increase youth use of cannabis. Multiple studies across multiple jurisdictions, along with national level data, clearly demonstrate that this is not the case. The Monitoring the Future survey has demonstrated in its last 2 editions that youth use of cannabis has remained flat in spite of increasing state legalization. I've submitted a comprehensive study highlighting these facts as Exhibit 1 to my written testimony. Instead, I suggest a better use of the committee's time today would be to focus on strategies to enhance provisions of the CAOA by, for example, incentivizing law enforcement agencies to deprioritize cannabis enforcement through COP and Brine Justice Assistance Grants, which have the potential to improve community police relations. Additionally, by strengthening provisions within the CAOA that allow for a gradual transition to interstate commercial activity, states will be better able to protect the nation's social equity programs that they're already working on and develop and prevent them from being co-opted by large corporate interests. These are just some of the opportunities that are well within the purview of this subcommittee and go a long way towards preserving states as the laboratories of democracy as envisioned by the late Justice Brandeis. The issue of cannabis reform is one of the few bipartisan issues of our time, and hopefully all of the senators on this committee can find ways to contribute to the improvement of the CAOA and bring an end to the historical injustices associated with cannabis prohibition. I thank you all for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burnett.
Thanks.
Dr. Chief Ed, you're up next.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Senator Booker, Chairman of the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Criminal Justice and Counterterrorism. Good afternoon to distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am Edward Jackson, Chief of Police, and I currently serve, as was stated, the city of Annapolis as their Chief of Police. Prior to my service in Annapolis, I served for over 21 years with the Baltimore Police Department, where I began as a patrolman and earned the rank of colonel before my retirement, subsequently returning as Chief of the Office of the Inspector General, tasked with increasing accountability for police officers, improving police-community relations. I participated in over 500 investigations, including narcotics and distribution crimes. As a law enforcement professional with more than 2 decades of experience, I've spent far too much time arresting people for selling and possessing cannabis when the reason I became a police officer was to make my community safer. After seeing the true cost of enforcing cannabis laws, I believe that it is time to end federal cannabis prohibition by passing the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act. I'm a member of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is a nonprofit organization of over 250 police, prosecutors, judges, and other criminal justice professionals who advocate for the improving for improving the justice system. Our mission is to unite and mobilize the voice of law enforcement support for drug policy and criminal justice reforms that will make communities safer by focusing law enforcement resources on the greatest threat to public safety, particularly violence, promoting alternatives to arrest and incarceration, and addressing root causes of crime by working towards healing police-community relations. LEAP supports the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act because we believe it will improve public safety and help heal police-community relations. Around the country, people, including police, are realizing that there is nothing inherently violent about selling, possessing, or using cannabis. Prohibition is what fuels violence and crime, not cannabis. Just as alcohol prohibition funded Al Capone, today's cannabis prohibition funnels millions of dollars to street gangs and cartels who use violence to protect their profits. Prohibition is what fuels violence and illegal activity, not cannabis. That is a big part of why moving cannabis from illegal markets to the legal market will improve public safety. In states where cannabis is legal, it is sold by licensed dispensaries that ensure the safety of their product, pay taxes, and check the age and IDs of potential buyers. Prohibition fuels illicit activity, not cannabis, again. Fortunately, the United States Senate has an opportunity to address this tragic and unnecessary violence by ending federal cannabis prohibition with the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act, which would remove cannabis from the federal list of controlled dangerous substances. Critically, the act would also help our police officers focus our efforts on higher priorities than cannabis. The problem hit me as a sergeant in West Baltimore. We were pulling over drivers randomly, making them late for work, detaining them unnecessarily when we heard gunshots. While we were on useless fishing expeditions, someone was shot 2 blocks away. That was a common occurrence. Yet, the FBI uniform reports reveals that more people continue to be arrested for cannabis than for all other violent crimes put together. Every hour, our patrol officers and drug squads arrest another young person for nonviolent cannabis offenses. And these officers quickly learn that the arrests do not keep cannabis off the street. Often before the arresting officer has finished filling out paperwork, a new young person has filled that spot. Instead, prohibition perpetuates a vicious cycle of people coming in and out of our justice system. A criminal conviction or arrest shuts people out of the legal job market and pushes them to the margins of society because of the barriers we erect for people with criminal records. In addition, I believe passing the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act would help improve police trust. After decades of the war on drugs, police community trust has become the weakest link in our ability to ensure public safety. In 2015, the city officials in Baltimore wanted enhanced drug policy in Gilmore Homes. Officers encountered a young man named Freddie Gray, arrested him, and he died in police custody. Public fury over Freddie Gray's death brought my beloved city to a boiling point. Since the tragedy, community trust in police and clearance rates are at historic lows, and homicide has spiked. With more than 600,000 cannabis-related arrests every year in the U.S., we have taught millions of families not to open their doors to the police. Anyone who has knocked on the door in a police uniform knows that the community trust is our strongest weapon in solving crime. Homicide detectives need neighbors to open their doors to share information in order for us to solve cases. Ending the federal prohibition will improve police community trust because officers will no longer arrest individuals for low-level, nonviolent marijuana offenses, instead focus their attention on violence in our communities. For all these reasons, I implore you to legalize cannabis on the federal level by passing the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act. This act will reduce cannabis-related violence and community members alike. It will stop wasting officers' time, form better relationships with the community, and help build trust. I would like to see some of these dollars that we spend in prosecuting cases go towards helping young people to realize their dreams and also prevention of getting involved in drugs and alcohol in the first place. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and considering this important legislation.
Mr. Angelos, forgive me for calling you Mr. Weldon before. I apologize, my friend, and I'm grateful for you're here, and I'm looking forward to your testimony.
Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Weldon Angelos, and I am the living proof of the benefits of second chances. Thank you for inviting me here today to share my personal experiences with the committee and to discuss the impact of prohibition on the lives of ordinary Americans like myself. Today's topic is critically important and affects the lives of millions of Americans, from those who have interacted with the criminal justice system to patients and veterans who get relief from cannabis. When I was 23 years old, I was working in the music industry as a producer for artists like Snoop Dogg and Tupac Shakur's group. It was my dream job. In addition to my music career, I was also selling small amounts of cannabis on the side to help pay the bills until my music venture stabilized. Unfortunately, my connections to the music industry and to hip-hop in particular made me the perfect target for law enforcement. After selling roughly $300 worth of cannabis to a confidential informant on 3 occasions, I was arrested, tried, convicted on 16 federal counts, the most serious of which included harsh mandatory punishments. The relevant statute, 924C, punished the combination of any amount of cannabis and a lawfully possessed firearm. It didn't matter that the drug was a small amount of cannabis. It didn't matter that the ownership and possession of the firearm was otherwise legal under state law. And it didn't matter that the firearm wasn't brandished or used. In fact, a defendant can be convicted for having cannabis and legal guns in his own home. In my case, all of these problems applied with a vengeance. For me, the result was a mandatory 55-year sentence, a punishment that even the judge who sentenced me called cruel, unjust, and even irrational. In 2016, thanks to the unrelenting advocacy of my family, bipartisan elected officials, and even the man who prosecuted me, I was finally released under President Obama's administration after serving 13 years. In 2020, I was fully pardoned by President Trump. Now that I'm no longer incarcerated, I have dedicated my life to ending cannabis prohibition and mass incarceration. I have worked on these issues with multiple presidential administrations and helped pass the bipartisan First Step Act. I founded the Weldon Project, a nonprofit that works to provide relief to those convicted of cannabis offenses. National cannabis reform must include 1, the release of federal cannabis offenders, 2, a true expungement and sealing of records, and 3, the creation of meaningful opportunities for the formerly incarcerated upon release. With the comprehensive approach to cannabis reform, we could immediately assist the many of the nearly 3,000 people who are serving federal prison time for cannabis, as well as the tens of thousands of individuals whose lives and futures are haunted by records of cannabis arrests, convictions, and sentences. This is why I was excited and grateful to see the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act introduced last week. This bill would help end the harmful criminal justice impacts of prohibition, all while allowing states the right to decide the direction their jurisdiction will take. Congress must also address the residual effects of cannabis convictions. Those with felony convictions can be politically disenfranchised, losing the right to vote, for instance. They lose other civil liberties, as well as lawful opportunities afforded to others in education and public housing. Cannabis convictions adversely impact credit scores, and they also impede or entirely prevent employment, creating permanent barriers to true participation in society. Even with a full presidential pardon, I still feel the stranglehold of my conviction in my home state of Utah. My prior conviction bars me from participating in the state's legal medical cannabis industry. The state refuses to issue licenses to individuals with felony convictions, even with a full presidential pardon. In California, the other state I call home, my criminal history prevents me from accessing credit, capital, and financing, despite having engaged in conduct that is now legal throughout the jurisdiction. As a result, I've been effectively shut out of an entire legal industry that is supposed to be one of the most equitable in the country. Today, however, I'm hopeful because of your consideration of the CAOA. It could be life-changing for individuals incarcerated in federal prison system for cannabis offenses. Each day, incarceration severely affects the mental and physical health of incarcerated individuals and negatively impacts their relationships with the outside world. And each arrest, prosecution, conviction, and sentence makes the world a little bit smaller for those who must live their lives bearing the modern scarlet letter. I realize I am one of the lucky ones. I am no longer inmate 100538081. I am a reform advocate with the immense pleasure of testifying before you today. But my fortune is not universal. I am reminded of all those I left behind in prison. many of who are people of color who continue to serve time for cannabis while predominantly white CEOs and entrepreneurs make millions from the recreational and medical cannabis industries around the country. The cannabis industry should be able to grow and thrive, but not at the expense of those who are still incarcerated. And as I think about cannabis reform and ensure the release of those who are still serving time in prison, we must also provide opportunities and resources to support reentry and create a pathway to expungement to stop the collateral consequences. I strongly believe we can build on the bipartisan success of the Criminal Justice Reform, the First Step Act, and continue to work to end the racially motivated cannabis policies that have endured for too many decades. Thank you again for including me in this historic hearing. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Angelos. Mr. Cook, I didn't have a chance to introduce you, but I do want to say thank you very much for being here and sharing your perspective and invite you to give your testimony.
Thank you, Senator. Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and address this important matter. I respectfully submit that the legislation currently under consideration is founded on 5 myths. In my written statement, I've addressed all 5 of these myths. This afternoon, I'd like to address 3. Myth number 1 that I'd like to address is that the criminal justice system is systemically racist. The suggestion that the criminal justice system is systemically racist is unfounded and perhaps the most destructive myth of all. This myth is premised entirely on the fact that minorities are arrested and incarcerated for drug distribution offenses at a rate greater than their represented numbers in the general community. Drug trafficking, like other crimes, is not committed by any group that mirrors the nation's demographics in terms of age, race, gender, and prosecutions cannot be expected to parallel those demographics. It is true that young and middle-aged minority males are convicted and incarcerated at higher rates than their relative numbers in the general population. That said, although all 3 categories, age, race, and gender, are disproportionately represented in prisons, there is no evidence that bias is driving those numbers. The truth is that drug trafficking is an inherently violent, harmful, and serious criminal activity, and those who engage in it should be held responsible regardless of their age, race, or gender. One final note on this issue, and that is a minute ago I observed that the unfounded allegations that the criminal justice system is systemically racist are destructive. There are hundreds of thousands of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and judges who have dedicated their careers to our criminal justice system. With only extraordinarily rare exceptions, those public servants are faithful to and consider sacred their oaths to the law, to see that the law of our nation is enforced fairly and without regard to race, gender, age, or any other inappropriate factor. At any time, I would add to that any time leaders in our community make comments that suggest otherwise, they're not only demeaning and demoralizing those dedicated public officials, but they undermine the public's confidence in the best criminal justice system in the world. Next myth I'd like to address is that retroactive application of changes in the law do no harm. The Supreme Court has often emphasized the importance of finality in our criminal justice system. And this is one quote from a Supreme Court case. The principle of finality is essential to the operation of our criminal justice system. Every time Congress makes retroactive changes to criminal law, substantial prosecutorial and judicial resources are diverted to the review and relitigation of past cases instead of addressing criminals victimizing Americans every day. The legislation under consideration would also undermine another related component of the criminal justice system, and that is plea bargaining. The current legislative proposal would release defendants based exclusively on the offense of conviction without regard to the possibility that other serious charges may have been dismissed as part of a plea agreement or dismissed or not pursued at all. One final thought on retroactivity and expungement of marijuana convictions. Individuals who have been elected to engage in this activity did not do so to promote some social cause that we have now come to realize is good and right. The essence of what they did was to blatantly disregard the laws of our nation for personal enrichment, and in doing so engaged in, perpetuated, and promoted violent international organized criminal activity. Congress should not absolve them by releasing them from prison or expunging them or expunging their convictions. The last myth I'd like to address is that legalizing marijuana will undermine the illegal marijuana trade. Mexican drug cartels are making billions of dollars annually from U.S. drug sales, and a substantial part of that income comes from marijuana. One of the principal goals of legalizing marijuana is said to be to disrupt illegal markets and remove this source of revenue from criminal organizations. The notion that drug cartels will simply close up shop trafficking in marijuana is naive and has already proved to be unfounded. Instead, what we have discovered is, under the cover of this new permissive legal framework, cartels have moved to growing and manufacturing marijuana here in the United States, free of substantial costs associated with smuggling, because it's being grown here, and because of their grow operations don't comply with labor, tax, or licensing laws. They're able to manufacture marijuana at a fraction of the cost by legal businesses. By one estimate, 5 years after legalization, in California, legal marijuana made up only 10 to 20% of the state's marijuana market. This is a win-win for organized crime. It allows them to operate at a reduced cost in a market with significantly increased consumption and demand. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you, and I welcome any questions that you
Mr.
may
Cook,
have.
thank you for your testimony.
Yes, sir.
Again, Mr. Burnson, thank you very much for being here, and you may commence with your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, honorable members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity to speak about this important topic. 3.5 years ago, Simon & Schuster published my nonfiction book, Tell Your Children, a detailed look at the links between cannabis, psychosis, and violence. Tell Your Children examines more than a generation of scientific research on the impact of THC, the active drug in cannabis, on mental illness. The book presents the strong evidence that early cannabis use can sharply raise the risk for schizophrenia, among the most devastating mental illnesses. And no one disputes that cannabis use can cause short-term paranoid and psychotic episodes in some users. Regular cannabis use impacts mental health in other, more subtle ways, too. Though many users believe it reduces their anxiety, like other drugs used as anti-anxiety medicine, it can cause severe rebound anxiety if users try to stop using quickly. Also, last year, a large study published by JAMA Psychiatry showed that regular cannabis use was associated with increased rates of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. Schizophrenia is a terrible disease, painful for users and devastating for their families. Its symptoms can be managed, but it has no cure, though people with schizophrenia do sometimes recover on their own as they age. But schizophrenia can have broader consequences too. Paranoia and psychosis are known factors increasing the risk of violence. People with schizophrenia commit violent crime at much higher rates than healthy people, and the gap increases along with the severity of the violence. Thus, the legalization, commercialization, or promotion of any drug that may raise the risk of schizophrenia or other mental illnesses is fraught with risk. It is no surprise that the cannabis industry and legalization advocates have done everything they can to play down the connection between cannabis and mental illness and to criticize or mock those who attempt to bring it to life. But the truth about cannabis and psychosis appears to be becoming so obvious that even outlets that have been staunchly pro-legalization cannot ignore them. Since 2014, the New York Times has called for cannabis legalization. Last month, however, the Times published a long article headlined Psychosis, Addiction, Chronic Vomiting. As weed becomes more potent, teens are getting sick. The Times is correct. Cannabis has become far, far more potent. In the 1990s, THC levels of 5% in flower cannabis were common. Today, that would barely qualify as cannabis at all in most dispensaries, what the industry calls its stores. 20% THC cannabis is more common, and the real crisis is in the increasing use of near-pure THC extract, usually as an oil that can be vaped, heated, and inhaled. The extracts are often odorless and colorless, and teens and young adults can use them in secret. Even vigilant parents may have no idea of what their children are doing. As the Times wrote last month, Elise was 14 when she first started vaping cannabis. It didn't smell, which made it easy to hide from her parents. and it was convenient. Just press a button and inhale. After the second or third try, she was hooked. It was insane euphoria, said Elise. I personally have heard many similar stories from police, parents, and users themselves since Tell Your Children was published. Indeed, the most frightening aspect of the current experiment with legalization is that the studies showing the link between cannabis psychosis, and other mental illnesses often depend on data that are 10 to 40 years old and do not capture the astonishing rise in the potency of cannabis in the last decade. Even regular users now frequently complain that cannabis is too strong, but the industry, legal and illegal, is focused on serving the daily users who make up most of its revenue and sometimes use stunning amounts of THC. In the last 20 years, heavy use, daily use, or near daily use has sharply increased, but more casual use has risen much more slowly. 2.5 or sometimes 5 milligrams of THC is considered the equivalent of one drink for a casual user, but tolerance builds up quickly. Heavy users often use 100 to 200 milligrams of THC and sometimes more. We have almost no idea at this point how this level of THC use will affect the brain long term, especially for people who start as teenagers and use for many years. The link between cannabis and mental illness is increasingly acknowledged. The potential link between cannabis and violence is more controversial. But what is clear is that major cities and states that legalize the recreational use of cannabis early, notably Denver, Seattle, and Portland, Oregon, have seen significant negative changes in public safety in the last decade. Denver and Portland have gone from being two of the safest major cities to two of the most dangerous, or two of the more dangerous, certainly. Correlation is not necessarily causation, but the promise that advocates made that cannabis legalization would aid public safety and reduce violent crime by allowing police to focus on non-drug offenses has proven demonstrably untrue. 5 years ago, Senator Booker, you said that legalization had led to decreases in violent crime in the states that had been early to legalize. That wasn't true then, and of course it's less true now. We also see specific cases in which heavy cannabis users become psychotic and commit bizarre and violent crime, often against family members. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for the testimony. I'm going to defer my time, and the order, therefore, is going to be Senator Dick Durbin. We're going to follow by the ranking member, Tom Cotton. Then we're going to follow that by Senator Padilla, then the Republican whip, and my colleague, John Cornyn, will follow. I will now turn to Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Angelos, you're not a witness. You're a legend. We have been talking about you for years, even while you were in jail. And the reason, of course, is one of the prosecutors is now a United States Senator, Mike Lee. And he told your story over and over again to remind us that what seems like thoughtful, meaningful sentencing can go spin completely out of control. And there you sat with a 55-year sentence. I can't tell you how many times we argued your case in this committee in constructing different approaches to sentencing. And I can recall that when I passed the measure that lowered the disparity between crack and powder cocaine from 100 to 18, your case was still brought up, though you weren't involved necessarily in any aspect of that. But it was to show just what happens when you go to 100 to 1 to get tough and end the war on drugs. You fill up the prisons, usually with the poorest people on earth, and the net result is a resentment and nullification when it comes time to pick a jury. Well, we went through all those arguments over the years, and we finally came to this conclusion that we could do something on a bipartisan basis, and we did. Again, your name was referred to time and time again on the First Step Act. We passed that bill, bipartisan bill, Grassley, Durbin, Grassley, depending on who was on top at the time. And we sent it to President Trump, who signed it into law, realizing that sentencing disparities had to be addressed directly and give more discretion to judges to inject the real world into these guidelines that we were sending out there. So I feel like I've known you a long time, and I thank you for being here today. You heard the testimony from Mr. Cook that the application of the laws on marijuana are not racially bigoted, not racially biased. Did you see a different world?
Absolutely. Nearly everyone I met in prison incarcerated for cannabis were Black and Latino.
That's my impression too, and the statistics back you up. Dr. Burnett, I said at one point when they asked me something that I thought was just logical. Would you be in favor of using cannabis for medical purposes? I thought it's a chemical. If a doctor thinks it's going to help you, How can I judge that it wouldn't? So I said yes. And then there came a time when they started opening up marijuana health clinics in my hometown. And they invited me to come into one and see how it worked. You ever been to one?
Of course.
So here's what I saw. They set me down at a table with the Vitruvian Man. You know what that is?
Yes, I do.
Leonardo da Vinci.
He hangs on my wall at my house.
And there were arrows pointed to different parts of your body. And next to those arrows, it said migraine headache, sore throat, lack of hearing, muscle pain. And at the end, it said certain XYZ 14, XYZ 18. I said, what is this? If you got a problem with migraines, you need this kind of marijuana. And if you got a problem with sore throat, you need this kind of marijuana. And I thought to myself, really? How do you know that? And I still ask that question. How does anybody know that? And I said, have there been studies by NIH or other agencies? Nope, but they won't touch it. It's a Schedule I narcotic. I said, well, where did this information come from? China, Europe, you name it, but it never was the United States. So I became kind of skeptical. This man who was for medical marijuana, when he looked at the Vitruvian Man, said, I think they're making this up. These people standing next to me in white coats aren't medical professionals, they're salesmen,
Right.
women. So now we have federal agencies that are talking for the first time about doing actual research to see if there is a positive thing that marijuana can be used for. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there is significant potential within the cannabis plan. I think Senator Cotton highlighted a lot of the points there relative to the pharmaceutical components of the plant, and if we were able to free universities, particularly from the fear of losing their federal funding, then they would be able to conduct these research studies, right? That's, in my experience, largely when we're trying to do these sort of studies in the various universities that I've been a part of, there is pushback through the IRB around whether or not we should do this research for fear of losing federal funding. And so if we remove cannabis from the schedule, it will allow the various NIH institutes to be able to participate.
And my obvious question is, why wouldn't we investigate it, research it, find out one way or the other whether it works, it doesn't work? What about my concern I expressed early on about keeping this out of the hands of kids? Now, we're naive to believe we'd keep it out of the hands of all kids,
Right.
but shouldn't we make a conscious effort to make sure the product is not sold to children?
Absolutely. I think that if we, part of the problem with us being able to engage in robust public health discussion is that we can't, because cannabis is prohibited. So it prevents us from being able to create responsible public health education campaigns around responsible use. If you look at the state of Colorado, once they changed the laws, their public health department was able to create a whole campaign about how you responsibly use cannabis. And when you looked at their state level data, the number of youth who were using cannabis actually, for the first couple of years, fell and then ultimately kind of remained flat.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Cotton.
Dr. Burnett, do you have a financial interest in the legalization of marijuana?
I do not.
You do not.
I do not at this time.
Through tribe companies, you're not invested in the marijuana business?
That company is no longer operational.
Okay. Mr. Cook. Sir. Senator Durbin said in his opening statement a scenario that is often described as someone being arrested in prison for having a dime bag of marijuana in their glove compartment or a joint in their glove compartment. In your many decades of prosecuting cases, how often was it the case that someone is prosecuted and sent to jail for having a dime bag or a joint in their glove compartment?
Well, thank you for asking that, because I've heard that throughout the remarks this morning. Never is the answer to your question in federal court. Federal court, we've focused on, consistently have focused on high-level drug traffickers involved in violent criminal activity, international drug trafficking activity, gang activity, and I could go on. But the short answer to your question is never.
Okay. So in none of those cases that I cited in my opening statement, you're confident that a federal charge is brought against someone who was merely possessing an amount of marijuana likely to be used for personal consumption?
No, in fact, the possession cases, if you look at the Sentencing Commission statistics on this, what you'll see is the possession case, simple possession cases that now exist in the federal system, all stem from seizures, almost all stem from seizures that occurred in border districts and involved, on average, 48 pounds. Not small simple possession cases.
By border districts, you mean our southern border?
I do, sir. I mean, California, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona,
And you say 48 pounds on average?
on average.
How many joints could you make out of 48 pounds of marijuana?
Outside my area of expertise, many,
Tens of thousands?
tens of thousands,
Okay.
I would think.
Mr. Berenson, you ignited some controversy when you wrote your book in 2019, and you said in your statement that you were surprised when marijuana advocates and certain media outlets attacked you for pointing out that, according to all of the scientific research, marijuana is not harmless. Why do you think your book provoked such a strong reaction?
I think that people have waged a campaign to legalize for a long time, and if you hear the statements in this room, it's as if it's 1975. I mean, cannabis is, as a practical matter, essentially legal in most of the United States right now, it's culturally promoted. It's very, very unlikely, I think, that trend is going to reverse, and certainly in large blue states. And yet the industry seems to see itself as this outside countercultural force, and reacts extremely strongly when you try to discuss the real downsides to this. I mean, we hear about a tremendous number of cannabis arrests. I would point out that even if cannabis were fully legalized on the federal level, there'd be a lot of cannabis arrests. And the reason I know that is because there's a ton of arrests for alcohol in the United States. Driving under the influence, alcohol possession in public. There will be a lot of cannabis arrests under any circumstances in the United States. The question is whether we want a legalized, commercialized industry that's promoting the use of this drug and is doing everything it can to play down the very real mental health consequences that come with it.
You used two verbs there, legalized and commercialized. I want to contrast that with the experience that Mr. Cook had in his many years of prosecuting cases with decriminalizing. Mr. Cook, do you think it's fair to say that many jurisdictions, in effect, decriminalized the possession of marijuana many years ago, in the sense that though it was illegal to possess small amounts of marijuana, it was not a law enforcement priority to arrest and charge mere possession of small amounts?
That's absolutely correct.
And that's very different, Mr. Berenson, from legalizing it, which makes it a legal act to possess any amount, and then taking a step further to commercialize it.
Yes, I mean there is a middle ground here. Decriminalization, I think, removes a lot of the harms that might come with arrests, and I think most Americans, if not practically all Americans, would agree you shouldn't go to jail or serve prison time for having a joint. The question is whether you want an industry.
You mentioned alcohol. People who sell beer, wine, and liquor for a living make a pretty good living, don't they?
I think so, sure.
There's a congressman from Maryland who makes a lot of money selling wine through Total Wine. Is that partly because the alcohol industry, in effect, creates a kind of legalized monopolies based on the 21st Amendment?
I mean, I'm not an expert on the structure of the alcohol industry. What I can say is that the commercialization of cannabis in states that have legalized, such as California, has proven actually quite problematic, because the community of users is very, very used to buying illicit cannabis and will happily do so at a lower price than the commercial industry. And so in California, for example, the industry is now complaining that it cannot compete with the illegal market and is asking for tax breaks, and eventually may wind up asking for outright subsidies. So you wind up with the worst of both worlds. You have a commercial industry that's going to promote its product legally on billboards and elsewhere, and you have all the problems of the illicit market. This is one reason why there continues to be a ton of violence associated with the illicit cannabis industry in California and in other states that have legalized.
Thank you.
Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and appreciate you having this hearing, important discussion. Like as you know, I agree with you that it's essential that we pass comprehensive federal legislation to not just deschedule and not just legalize marijuana nationwide, but also regulate. Right? Let's be informed by what some of the states have done. I appreciate my home state of California being referenced just a minute ago, where The evolution, not just in public opinion, but in the laws of California was, I believe, thoughtful and frankly voter-driven. Years ago, when voters of California took us in the direction of legalizing marijuana for medical purposes only first. And there was significant time that went past before we took the leap. We weren't the first. It was after Washington, after Colorado, in allowing for recreational use. But again, with regulation, taxation, everything that comes with. So the goal of descheduling, legalizing, regulating is something that obviously could be achieved under the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, which would, among other things, also require the expungement of federal nonviolent cannabis convictions and provide for resentencing for individuals that are currently incarcerated for marijuana offenses. The bill would also limit negative consequences resulting from certain marijuana offenses on immigration proceedings. It would prevent discrimination with respect to public benefits and aid state efforts to provide loans and establish licensing programs for small businesses in the industry. My first question is for Mr. Angelos. I'll echo Senator Durbin's comments on your impact, your experience, and its impact on the conversation here. I'd love to hear from you just a little bit more. How do you think expungement of marijuana offenses would help others who are or have been in your situation?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator. I think expungements are absolutely critical. Even myself, with a pardon, still cannot fully participate in society. When I first got out, I wasn't even able to get an apartment because of my felony conviction, and so it prevents me from actually having a meaningful second chance.
Yeah, that's pretty common for folks, like I said, in or have been in your situation. Being able to apply for a job, right? There's a reason there was a whole Ban the Box campaign, and we're slowly making progress there. Dr. Burnett, question for you. Could you speak to the racial aspect built into our current sentencing system and how it has exacerbated the economic, mental, and educational inequities that we see throughout the country?
Yeah, I think that when you compare the harms associated with cannabis use to the harms associated with being incarcerated, it's a night and day comparison. I mean, as Mr. Angelos has demonstrated, you have significant constraints on your ability to be able to participate in society after coming out of a criminal justice system, which bans you across the board, whether you're participating in trying to get a job, trying to get an apartment, trying to vote, trying to just be a meaningful member of society. If you want to be healthy, you have to be welcomed back into society, and I think that we can do a lot through this act to be able to facilitate second chances for people who have been harmed by cannabis prohibition.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair and colleagues, something I hope that we stay mindful of as we move towards not just legalization, but regulation, as I mentioned. We know the disproportionate impact through the criminal justice system on communities of color, African Americans, Latinos, but in the areas where marijuana has been legalized, only 1% of businesses in the field are Black owned.
Totally.
So we really do have to take a holistic view in all this. In my time remaining, Mr. Chair, I just want to touch a little bit upon law enforcement and an aspect of being smarter on crime. The enforcement of marijuana offenses has been incredibly costly for governments, particularly state and local governments. I know before legalization in California, it was estimated to cost the state $300 million per year to enforce marijuana laws. That's just the state tab. Even more troublesome than the cost, these efforts were often aimed at criminalizing individual offenders, sometimes for little as a joint, rather than large traffickers, which has been the source of hundreds of thousands of marijuana-related arrests across the country. And those in the trafficking business are probably trafficking more than just marijuana. So that's where the focus should have been, but it wasn't. The legalization of marijuana for medical and recreational use has freed law enforcement to focus more on more serious issues. Chief Jackson, could you speak to how federal cannabis laws divert resources from more serious crimes and discuss the types of crimes your department is now able to focus resources on?
Yes, one of the things that's not in my biography, from the time I retired from the Baltimore Police Department until my current position, I was a professor of sociology and criminal justice at a community college. And in working on my dissertation, I've learned some pretty interesting things, and that there are certain fundamental aspects of American life and our democracy that we have to address. You know, we have to address the institution of family, we have to address the institution of our education, and even, I think, in my personal opinion, more importantly, our faith-based institutions. Absence of those, then you're going to have heavy-handed police, and especially minority communities, you're going to have heavy-handed, the heavy-handed burden of courts and corrections. We run a reentry program. I take a social approach to law enforcement now, meaning that in order to have stabilization in communities and peace in the communities, you got to address the root causes of crime to begin with. And so when inmates are paroled in the city of Annapolis, come back to the city of Annapolis, what we do, senators, we embrace them, and we try to get them out of the environment that caused them to have to go into the illicit drug trade to begin with. We try to find them jobs. This is the Annapolis PD. I have sworn members who assist young men and women to get jobs, to get them their GED, a driver's license. We have partnerships with the state of Maryland. I wish we had more federal support for those type of programs. And I do think that the target has been most of our clients, so to speak, for lack of a better term, are minority men, the vast majority of them, some minority women. And as I sit here and listen to the testimony today, I came into law enforcement. I graduated from the Baltimore Police Department 40 years ago. And many of my commanders and supervisors were World War II, Korean War veterans. It was a different American, a different mindset. We were systematically socialized that the prototypical drug dealer and those individuals involved in the drug distribution ring, whether it be marijuana or more serious, dangerous drugs like heroin and cocaine, were African-American males. And we were taught to target them in our enforcement efforts. And we were strategically put into places throughout Baltimore City to address that. And the running joke was that if you wanted to transport drugs in Baltimore, then you would get a white male to do it because they were far less likely to be targeted or stopped for the enforcement of drugs. So when I came back into law enforcement, it's been my mission for the time that I have as the chief of police in the city of Annapolis is take a more social approach so we don't have to react to social disorganization. We can be it on the front end. And that's what's so important about the power of the federal government. If this act it becomes law, then it sends a strong message to local jurisdictions far beyond the capital city of Annapolis that we're serious about prison reform, we're serious about mass incarceration, and we're serious about
Chief Jackson, I appreciate it, but Senator Cornyn and I have got a good relationship with him that I'm eroding quickly by not deferring to him and letting him
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
ask questions.
Yes, Senator.
Don't blame it on me.
For the record, I withdraw my blame.
Am I recognized, Mr. Chairman?
You are recognized,
Thank
sir.
you. Dr. Burnett, is smoking tobacco bad for you?
Absolutely.
Cause cancer, right?
Large amounts.
If you smoke marijuana, do the products of combustion from smoking marijuana, is that carcinogenic as well?
You know, there have been a lot of studies on this looking for exactly this issue, and it's very, very unclear relative to the outcomes of those studies, particularly around lung cancer.
Kidding me.
I'm
You
not.
smoke tobacco, you can get cancer, but if you smoke marijuana, it's you don't have to worry about it.
I wouldn't go as blanket a statement as you would, but I would say that the research is not as clear as it is for tobacco.
So you think smoking marijuana is innocuous?
I didn't say that either.
Okay, that's my next question.
Okay.
The Food and Drug Administration has determined that marijuana has a high potential for abuse and does not have any accepted medical use in the United States. Do you agree with the Biden Food and Drug Administration?
Well, I think that the Food and Drug Administration said that before the Biden administration, but
Well, it's still on the books, right?
it is, and I think that they probably should reform that idea.
How about, how about the Surgeon General? Surgeon General Jerome Adams issued an advisory pointing out, as Mr. Berenson said, that the percentage of concentration of THC has gone up dramatically over the years, and he warned about the harmful effects of marijuana on the developing brain. Is that a concern of medical science?
I do believe that there is concern relative to youth use, but I would say that when we're talking about the issue of potency, you have to understand relative to potency that it is going to change the user's subjective use of the substance, right? And so if we're talking about the increased percentage of THC in cannabis, then what probably is going to result is that most users of that drug are going to reduce the total amount of consumption that they're using in any one setting.
Well, the user doesn't know what they're consuming, do they?
Well, that would be why we would need to regulate it so that we can provide appropriate testing to be able to inform users of what it is that they are doing.
Chief, as a practical matter at the state and local level, simple possession of marijuana is not being prosecuted today. Is that right?
It's being prosecuted, but by way of citation. It's been decriminalized for, I think.
You get like a speeding ticket, I guess.
Yes, that's correct, sir.
And so, as I understand your position today, are you referring to simple possession, or are you referring to any possession of marijuana, including people who are engaged in the trafficking of marijuana?
I was talking about the aggregate, Senator. More recently, you're absolutely right, 10 grams or less in the state of Maryland. It's only, you can't arrest anymore. You have to issue a citation. It's not, not entered into the criminal justice system, but I was just talking about the evolution of it. I remember the days where one joint would get you incarcerated.
I remember those days, but what I'm trying to understand is when you're talking about decriminalizing marijuana, you're talking solely about personal possession, or you're talking about the business of selling marijuana, that whether it's a cartels or whether it's some licensed cannabis dispensary?
I favor just legalizing it and have the government tax it, much like we do alcohol and tobacco, and then some of the proceeds from those billions of dollars that we could potentially garner from taxes go to education programs. No, I don't want 12-year-olds to smoke marijuana. I don't want kids to become engaged. I don't want it to be a gateway for children to use drugs, but I also don't want it to be a gateway for this mass incarceration. So if we could take those dollars and reinvest and regulate it, that would create job opportunities on so many levels. And so that's what I'm in favor of. That would free us up to address.
Are there any other drugs that you would decriminalize?
No, sir. Right now, I'm not prepared to say that.
Just marijuana?
Just marijuana, yes,
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Berenson, I think you alluded to the fact that vaping and use of e-cigarettes is pretty widespread among young adolescents, and the danger of consuming concentrates of THC that are vastly higher than what you would consume if you were smoking the plant. Is that a concern of yours?
Yes. I mean, you can smoke a lot of THC with flower cannabis, but it's much easier with the vaping product. By the way, I would agree with Dr. Burnett that there's not very good evidence that cannabis use leads to lung cancer. Surprisingly, there's not a lot of evidence of that.
Well, I just remember spending a lot of time and money saying that smoking tobacco was bad for you. Now we're going to say smoking marijuana is innocuous from the standpoint of carcinogen.
It causes enough other problems.
Mr. Cook, my experience and observation with the drug cartels is that they're pretty much commodity agnostic. They'll sell you anything that you will buy. Why is it that even in those states where marijuana use has been decriminalized or legalized, that the cartels continue to engage in that business? And I assume, as you said, comes along with it violence, protecting territory, market share. A lot of this connected to street gangs that are the distribution network for illicit drugs in the United States. Could you explain why, if it's legalized in these states, that the cartels and these street gangs would continue to be involved in the business?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. The reality out there is exactly what you just said, and that is we're not putting the cartels out of business. What we've done in states like California and Colorado especially is put them in a position where they can now move their manufacturing, that is to say grow operations, here to the United States. Because under the cover of decriminalization and less emphasis on marijuana, they can now operate huge manufacturing operations. That saves them the cost of smuggling across the border. That's one of the most significant risks the cartels have. You've taken that away from them, and now they move into the state. They then compete with legitimate businesses who we had hoped to promote, and they compete with them at an unfair level because now they're not paying taxes, they're not complying with license laws, they're not complying with labor laws, and now they're out there distributing the very same product they were at a cheaper price. And where do you think consumers are going to go? Consumption is up, so now they have an expanded market and a reduced cost. At the same time, the other element of what you just suggested is happening. Down in Mexico, the resources that they've saved from not growing marijuana have now been shifted to manufacturing methamphetamine, heroin, and fentanyl. So we've given them a double win-win. They're better off in the United States growing. They're better off down in Mexico with increased resources to address, to manufacture and distribute other drugs.
Mr. Chairman, if I can ask unanimous consent to make part of the record a report by the U.S. Senate Caucus on International Narcotics dated March 2021. This is entitled Cannabis Policy, Public Health, and Safety Issues and Recommendations. I'd ask unanimous consent that be made part of the record.
Without objection, and before we go to Senator Whitehouse, I also want to put into the record, with unanimous consent, that number one, a study published titled Impact of Marijuana Legalization on Crime Reduction is being underestimated, as the study finds. And I also want to put into the record the Uniform Crime Reports, UCR data from 2007 to 2017, using a difference in difference analysis and the scientific method to look at the effect of recreational marijuana legalization on clearance rates, and that in the state of Oregon studied, it's shown to have an impact on the ability to clear other violent crime. Without objection, I'll enter those into the record, and now I will move on to Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman Booker. Here in the Judiciary Committee, we can see how things have changed on this issue because you can go to college, you can go to law school, you can pass the bar exam, and after you've done all that, you can smoke pot. And as long as you did it 5 years before you turn up here, you can be nominated to be a federal judge. So clearly things are moving. In May, Rhode Island legalized, regulated, and taxed marijuana use. And one of the concerns in the legislative discussion at the Rhode Island General Assembly on the way to that was the concern of our police chiefs regarding cannabis-impaired driving. And I'm interested in a couple of questions about that. I think probably Chief Jackson, you'd be the first person I'd ask. One is, it appears fairly difficult to detect compared to an alcohol sample. There isn't a lot of technology in place to do that. The second is, because it's difficult to detect, the quality of the data about the incidence of driving while cannabis impaired is not so great. Very often somebody who's doubly impaired, they've been drinking and they've been smoking or consuming cannabis, what they'll test for is the alcohol because that's what you can test for, so you get a false negative as to the degree of cannabis intoxication. There is drug recognition expertise, training that can be given that preliminary indications show can be useful in helping a police officer identify that. But those of us who've been in the business know that if you actually have to go in and testify and be cross-examined on your drug recognition expertise and all of that, it's a lot more difficult to process than to have received a particularly high blood alcohol level that is pretty well-established technology. So what is your reaction to the drug-impaired driving aspect of all of this? You must see it in your regular life. What do we need to do to solve that problem as marijuana use becomes more widespread and more legal.
And you're absolutely right, Senator Whitehouse. We were having this discussion on the way down here. With alcohol, you can measure it through blood, the BAC, your blood alcohol content. Like most states, 0.08 is the threshold that would establish probable cause for arrest. But marijuana is different. And I do support, as a part of the regulation, that people not drive impaired for marijuana. What I suggest is that with the help of the federal government, that we develop better training for local law enforcement. Because you're absolutely right. Most instances when we suspect individuals are being impaired through marijuana use, we give them a field sobriety test, a physical test, which is not very reliable. Most of the cases we lose in court, especially if we find no alcohol in their bloodstream. We just lose the case in court because the training and the testing hasn't been able to withstand legal scrutiny. So
The field sobriety test.
the field sobriety test. Right, we have them stand on one foot and put their hands over their head and turn around and dance or do whatever we do. And then if it's not to our satisfactory, we make the capricious judgment that this person is driving impaired, which is not dependable. So we end up losing those cases. If marijuana was legalized, I'm in full support of not getting behind the wheel of a 3,000-pound vehicle and operate and hold them, just like we hold them accountable with alcohol. But we need better testing. We need more research and better testing to measure a person who's impaired by the use of cannabis.
Understood. Thank you, Chief. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Klobuchar.
Very good. Thank you very much, Senator Booker. Thank you for holding this important hearing. And I guess I would start with you, Dr. Burnett. And I think you know that our marijuana was first classified as a Scheduled I drug in 1970. And could you talk about how the medical field's understanding of marijuana changed since it was classified as a Schedule I drug in 1970?
Certainly, Senator Klobuchar. If I could make one point about this exact time period, there was a entire commission, the Schaefer Commission, which actually recommended that the scheduling of cannabis not be put into Schedule I because there would result a significant amount of arrests for individuals or American citizens. And so this is exactly what has happened since that time. But just getting right back to your question, the medical community, because of the Schedule I status, basically has its hands tied around being able to understand the therapeutic potential of the cannabis plant. As I mentioned before, universities are not able to appropriately fund research to understand the pharmacological and therapeutic benefits that are potentially within the cannabis plant. And, that has largely caused a lot of physicians to be able to take a hands-off approach on this. But there are, a select group of physicians that, especially as states have rolled out medical cannabis, who have begun to hear from their patients directly around the benefits.
We're one of those states in Minnesota, and of course we have incredible research institutions, and the same thing that you've said. Yeah. Even when it's legalized for medical reasons, the classification gets in the way of the research.
Exactly.
Especially, and we think about things like Alzheimer's, cancer, you name it. Then I think I'll turn to you, I think I'll ask you this, Dr. Burnett, actually.
Okay.
So we know there are significant disparities in the way our marijuana laws have been enforced. Even though Americans of all races use marijuana at similar rates, Black Americans are more than 3 times more likely to be arrested for possessing marijuana. This is one of the reasons I support the legalization and efforts to expunge prior nonviolent offenses, which I know you've discussed. Can you talk about the long-term impact this federal criminalization has?
Yeah, I think it further perpetuates the wealth and inequality gaps that I know many of the senators here are concerned about, right? If you have a criminal record, as Mr. Angelos talked about, you are incredibly held back from being able to make economic gains, participate in society in an honest way, and that increases the level of recidivism. And so, we've got a disproportionate amount of resources being poured into communities of color for law enforcement, and instead of economic development, and that's why you see the disparity that you see today.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And Mr. Angelos, I know Senator Padilla asked you a question about how this can affect people's lives, a conviction for this, but could you talk about why it's important to expunge certain prior offenses and that should be part of any effort to decriminalize it?
As I mentioned earlier, the lack of expungement prevents true participation in society. Having a felony conviction on my record when I got out prevented me from getting a good job. Even with the full presidential pardon, I still couldn't get an apartment because it comes up. And a kind of a funny story, I was invited to the Biden administration at the White House, and I almost didn't get in because
You're invited for like an event or something?
to talk about cannabis convictions and clemency. And so the fact that I'm going there to discuss this and I almost didn't get in because of a conviction that's been pardoned still comes up, and despite 12 previous White House admissions. And so expungement's extremely important.
Okay, very good. Anything you want to add to this discussion, Chief?
No, I heard something that struck me, and many times I have discussions with my officers and investigators, and a Schedule I drug has no medicinal use. And I'm quite often asked the question if, on one hand, we hear that marijuana helps support glaucoma, certain types of cancer, that's medical. So why is it still a Schedule I, which indicates that it has no medicinal use in the United States of America? So I think that that's a point that definitely needs to be cleared up, because we're sending mixed messages that on one hand it does have some medical qualities, but on the other hand it's classified as a Schedule I.
Exactly. Thank you. I guess one last question on that, Dr. Burnett. Many of our veterans, of course, suffer from conditions like chronic pain, and under current law, VA physicians aren't allowed to recommend or even discuss medical marijuana. I'm a co-sponsor of Senator Schatz's bill that would allow VA physicians to tell interested veterans about medical marijuana treatment options. Could you talk about how these limits harm veterans dealing with pain and PTSD?
Totally. I think that I have a number of colleagues. I mean, Dr. Seuss comes to mind, who's done extensive research on the potential therapeutic benefits of cannabis for PTSD, and the fact that there's a muzzle on VA doctors, probably calls into question their First Amendment right to be able to speak freely, but that's the nature of the VA. And so, it very much is a challenge for our, war veterans who served bravely overseas to be able to have to come back and get suboptimal care or have our options limited based on their veteran status.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wonderful hearing.
Thank you very much. Before I start my question, I just want to put into the record our CRS, Congressional Research Service report last month that talked about that marijuana trafficking from Mexican cartels has decreased and will continue to decrease as a result of the growing legal market in the United States. I also, gentlemen, you're coming towards the end. I'm going to ask my 5 minutes, defer to the ranking member for a few last questions. I'll follow up with a few last questions. Then the record will stay open. We'll ask more questions, I'm sure, and senators who have had their schedules drawn in many different directions, I have a feeling are going to want to submit questions for the record, okay? So I'll begin with my questioning. And I just want to begin because there's two men who served on the front lines of law enforcement, probably had the same experience with me. Chief Jackson, I think you would agree with Chief Cook. The men and women that served, the 1,000+ police officers I watched every day, some of the bravest people I know, none of them that I knew of were going out and saying, I'm going to racially disparately charge marijuana. That just does, I don't see that happening. Did you see that happening?
No, we've evolved. You don't see it happen as much as you did 30 years ago.
So let me get to my question then. So we I think three of us would agree that these men and women are some of the bravest folk. I've seen them run into buildings with a shooting going on, no situational awareness to save lives.
Absolutely.
But yet we still have these facts. Marijuana usage in the United States of America is generally equal amongst the races. Yet African Americans are going to prison, Latinos are going to prison or being arrested and charged with a great degree more. How do you jive what I agree with Mr. Cook saying, that this is not overt racism? How do you jive that then? How do you account for the fact that there's that disparity that goes on when it comes to marijuana enforcement?
I think it's an economy in many poor cities in America, so it's more pronounced amongst minorities. They don't have access to Fortune 500 companies. Many of them can't get good legally paying jobs. So
And so I would pause there because I want to turn to the doctor because I know you've researched it. So my experience, again, I went to Stanford, Yale, saw a lot of marijuana usage, different enforced. Nobody's doing raids in college campuses. Doctor, you've heard that what Chief Jackson said, Dr. Jackson said. What would you say that counts for it?
You know, I think that there are differences in when we're thinking about the application of race, and no individual, I think, within law enforcement. I agree with both you and Mr. Cook is coming in with, or at least the vast majority of them, not coming in with overt racist sense. But the system, right, the distribution of money, power, and resources into the community, and the burden or the over distribution of police resources within communities of color is what's resulting in that. Where the police are, they have a job, they're going to do what it is that they're going to do. They're not as more, densely distributed within white communities because that would create problems, and you guys as senators would receive lots of calls.
Right, and the consequences, I've seen this, again, I agree with, Mr. Cook said a lot of things that I firmly agree with. This is not a federal prosecutors coming in, but in the station house, when a kid has been arrested with a lot of drugs, I know in my neighborhood, where I grew up in a relatively white privileged area, there's station house adjustments, a lot of things, but the kids from lower income communities, what happens?
They go to jail. They don't have the advocates, the community-based resources, the influence to be able to change the station house sort of environment. They just receive the cold, hard justice of the criminal justice system.
And then how do you account for the 13% longer sentences for the same crime when you control for other factors?
I think that that's what we're talking about. It's a systematic racist problem, right? So the system, from the officer on the ground all the way up through the prosecutor, all the way up through the judge.
You're not accusing judges, you're not accusing officers of being overtly racist, you're saying?
No, this is the system and the way it's designed.
Okay, that's what I wanted to get at. Now, can you talk, because again, Mr. Berenson's had a lot of experience and an expert in this area. Obviously, he's testifying before Congress. You as a doctor, you said you studied the mental health impact of people who use marijuana. You wrote a paper entitled Prioritizing Mental Health in the Emerging Market. Could you help me understand that is there a causal link that exists between marijuana usage and mental health disorders?
There is no causal link between mental health, cannabis use and mental health disorders. Now, individuals who have predilection towards mental health disorders, if they so happen to use cannabis, could have an exacerbation or a incidence of those mental health disorders occurring. But it's not the opposite way. It's not where it doesn't start with the cannabis. It starts with the individual and their their family history, their environment and the way they grew up, and all of those other factors which may lead them to actually have an emerging mental health disorder.
So then let me get to the core question, then I'll turn to Senator Cotton. So then help me understand why people would be safer, why we could possibly see less crime, like the thing I've entered in for the record, why we would address more equity in law enforcement if we did not have a patchwork of federal law, of state laws, but instead had a federal law like one of the ones under consideration. Could you explain that to me?
Sure.
Why the public is better off in terms of a safety standpoint and equity in law enforcement?
We'd have clarity, right? There's, as the chief described, right, his own officers are confused about this matter, right? We'd have clarity, we'd have the ability to engage as a full society using all the tools that we have within government to be able to provide safe, tested, regulated cannabis. Mr. Cook reported that the cartels are, taking advantage of the system, but that's because we don't have clarity. If we had clarity, we would be able to identify the operators within the system who are following the law and those that are not following the law, and be able to go after those that are not following the law in order to be able to bring them into compliance. What we need at this point in time is not a patchwork of law, but clarity from the federal government regarding at least the criminal status of cannabis, and allow the states to be able to effectively regulate it on the ground.
And that's, because it was a throwaway joke, but I want to get to the bottom of this also. This illegal business is able to take advantage of this patchwork of laws, and the fact that there are certain tax write-offs that you can apply for, that other businesses can, to get more of a fair legal playing field.
Sure.
So it's not like people are asking for subsidies for their marijuana business.
Absolutely not.
They're asking for a fair, economic playing field, treated like other businesses, they would get a lot of the same tax write-offs that other businesses would get, and would make them be able to, again, outcompete this illegal market and eventually put it further and further into the rearview mirror.
Right. The reason why there's a gap between the illicit market and the regulated market is because the regulated market is not able to, subscribe to the normal economics of capitalism and commerce, right? So therefore, the illegal market, is able to operate with impunity in a lot of places, and so this creates this dichotomy, and ultimately drives up the price of at the consumer level, causing people to prefer to maintain the illegal market.
Okay, gentlemen, Senator Cotton, then myself, then you're free to go.
All right, thanks.
Mr. Berenson, Dr. Burnett just testified that there is no causal link between marijuana and mental health disorders. Do you care to comment on that statement?
I would strongly disagree with that statement. In any one case, it's going to be hard to unwrap correlation and causation. But when you look at large national data sets, you can see clearly, for example, in Scotland in the last few years, with the increased use of cannabis by young people, there's been a large increase in psychiatric presentations related to cannabis psychosis. U.S. mental health data is quite bad, so we are sort of stuck looking at other countries. But this is what Tell Your Children is all about. There's been really a generation now of science and research conducted by people who really don't have any ideological reasons to put their thumb on the scale. And among other things, there's data looking at temporality. So does evidence of psychosis predate cannabis use? Does evidence of cannabis use predate psychosis? Is there a back and forth? When you follow enough people long enough for enough years, you can see clearly that the causality runs in the direction of use, leading to higher rates of severe mental illness. So I would disagree strongly about that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cook, I want to address something that you started out in your opening statement about the three myths. Three of the myths we're discussing here today, and also something that came up in Senator Padilla's questioning. You talked about retroactive changes to criminal law and the myth that they do no harm. Senator Padilla called for the expungement and resentencing. I think you're talking about the same things, or at least one is the predicate of the other, making criminal law and sentencing changes retroactive, so felons in prison can then go and have their records expunged and then be resentenced or even released. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, sir.
And your most basic point was this is a complete and utter waste of time of law enforcement officials and prosecuting attorneys who should be spending their time arresting and getting convictions of criminals who are committing crimes today, as opposed to spending their time on felons who've been sitting in prison for years trying to get a second bite of the apple. Is that right?
That is exactly right, sir. And what my bigger point is that this would be extraordinarily disruptive to the federal criminal justice system, because the number of criminals in prison who have some form of prior conviction for a marijuana drug trafficking offense or similar offense, every one of those would have to come back. Every one of them would have to be reviewed. Every one of them would have to be resentenced. And to say that would be disruptive would be an extraordinary understatement.
So let's just look carefully at that situation. And again, building on your previous testimony that there are, in effect, no federal prisoners who are in federal prison for mere possession of amounts of marijuana that are used for personal consumption versus drug traffickers and drug kingpins. Do drug traffickers who are involved in multiple types of trafficking sometimes take a plea deal where they plead guilty to one type of charge, like say marijuana trafficking, in exchange for prosecutors dropping other charges?
Happens every day. In fact, the statistics I mentioned earlier on the southwest border reflect that people involved in distribution quantities are pleading down to simple possession cases, but it happens every day in every district.
Okay. So you've been a federal prosecutor for more than a day. If federal prosecutors think that sentences for certain types of crimes will be retroactively changed or even eliminated by legislation down the road, would you expect that they'd stop offering so many plea deals?
Absolutely, they're going to have to, and what they'll have to do is load up on people to get them to plead to everything that they anticipate won't be made illegal.
So if prosecutors don't offer so many plea deals and they do, as you say, load up on the charges, will average sentences in the federal prison population increase or decrease?
Increase, without a question.
So it sounds like this legislation would be hurting the very people it's trying to help.
It would in certain categories, absolutely.
All right, one final line here. Let's say we have a repeat drug trafficker who's been convicted several times of trafficking different kinds of drugs, say marijuana and cocaine. If he's convicted a third time, this time let's say of fentanyl trafficking, or maybe for using a gun in that crime, then the fact that he has those 2 prior federal drug convictions means he'll face a tougher sentence. Isn't that right?
It is.
If his marijuana conviction is later expunged and he is resentenced without that past marijuana trafficking conviction on his record, would that fentanyl trafficker get a reduced sentence or be released earlier?
The change in criminal history is going to affect convicted felons in a number of ways. First, many career offenders, individuals classified as career offenders, their criminal history category will change and their sentence could be substantially reduced. Likewise, individuals who are enhanced under 21841B1 A, B, and C, all of those call for enhanced sentences for prior felony drug convictions. Every one of those individuals would have to be resentenced. It'd be a nightmare to administer this in the federal system.
Thank you.
If I could address, may I address one other question that was raised
By all means.
by Senator Booker as well as
Please.
Thank you, sir. The issue continues to be confused between the disparity in arrests of individuals for simple possession and the federal prison population. The statistic Senator Klobuchar mentioned is that individuals for simple possession, white versus black, are 4-to-1, where the usage is equal. What that has nothing to do with is our federal system, because our federal system, we are prosecuting drug traffickers. Nobody has suggested anybody's turning a blind eye to drug traffickers across the country.
Sir, can I, Tom, excuse me, Senator Cotton, may I stick
done.
with that? Yeah. I just want to stick with that point, but you do recognize, and I know you're focused, you've been a federal prosecutor for a long time, but you did start off in local police, correct, if I remember?
Yes, sir.
So those arrests that she points to, that disparity, because I think you are a sincerely earnest person about protecting lives and saving this country from crime, and that's why I have a lot of respect for your position. But so the question I want to ask you, though, what she does point out on the local level, that disparity between, say, the Stanford student and the person that lives in my community, that is problematic, yes?
I have those statistics to take at face value, but my experience on the street was not that anybody was turning a blind eye to crime committed by white people or not, or disparately enforcing it as to minority individuals. What I think was happening, and I think perhaps Dr. Burnett or one of the other witnesses alluded to this, and that is law enforcement resources are often allocated disproportionately to high crime areas. Those sadly are disproportionately minority communities. And with a disproportionate law enforcement presence, you're going to have a disproportionate number of arrests. Not because there's any systemic racism, but because the enforcement efforts are focused in those areas, in the high crime areas.
Right, and the labels, now I'm really realizing, in the Senate, get people, if you say systemic racism, people often fall into their camps. But the problem is that we do have, if you are a black kid, a low-income black kid in America using marijuana, your chances of being arrested for that crime are a lot different than the Stanford black kid who is using at the same rate. That's not the scales of justice that we want. And you made such an important point, sir, that really resonates with me as a guy who was the only senator in our country that lives in a low-income black and brown community, which is the legitimacy of our police departments. It's what Mr. Jackson said, the trust that the community has. And I can't tell you, sir, this may not seem obvious, but I do sit in black barbershops a lot. And Chief Jackson and especially Dr. Burnett, just because you're another bald black man, you understand what it says to parents law-abiding parents who want the best for their children, how they feel about police officers when they watch presidents joke about their marijuana usage, vice presidents joke about their marijuana usage, and yet they know that their kids have criminal charges for doing things that judges, senators, congresspeople, presidents, and vice presidents does. That erodes the legitimacy overall, community trust, and the belief in a system that is necessary for us to be successful. Would you agree, Chief Dr. Jackson and Dr. Burnett?
Absolutely. That's exactly it.
Right, and so that's the hard thing for me. When I first started knocking on doors running for my office, again, a guy from the suburbs, now running for office in an inner city community, and door after door after door to meet a usually African-American woman who talks to me about their son, their spouse, and the nonviolent drug charges that are evident in destroying their lives and their economic potential to the point where they can't get a job at McDonald's. Mr. Angelos, you've been through the system. Friends of mine from Charlie Kushner, Jared Kushner's father, all the way to you, who've been through the system, somehow get it even more so about how unfair this is to families who get caught up in the war on drugs. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. My family was completely destroyed by my arrest and incarceration. I grew up on welfare, and when I got in the music industry, it was a dream come true. But when I was incarcerated, my sons, I never wanted them to have to be in the system, but they had to rely on welfare services because I was removed from the home for 13 years, and my sons had to grow up without a father. My oldest son developed depression issues. My father passed away right before I was released from prison. So it was completely just a nightmare.
So I thank you for that. I just have two more lines of question, and I think, Dr. Burnett, you're the best person to answer both of these for me. The first is my colleague and somebody I again value said that right now, seem to indicate that right now we can study this substance, that there is enough understanding for us to have open influx of resources to understand this, because I think there's a lot of problems with even the so-called legalized areas because we just don't know enough. How is that wrong? Is there that there's not enough unfettered study going on? How does a Schedule I, us scheduling marijuana as a Schedule I substance in any way undermine the ability for us to really better understand this substance?
Fundamentally. I mean, it undermines every facet of how you would go about doing research on any issue, right? Like, so you've got, let's just say we take public policy and the impact of cannabis legalization efforts across the board in this country, right? You can't get the funding necessary unless you're a private corporation like RAND to be able to effectively look at this as a university professor, right? We can't even know how well or any of the problems that, even any of my colleagues here who have testified about, even the mental health issue that we're in disagreement about, we don't have the data here because the research can't be done because of the schedule, right? And so if we really want to understand this issue as a nation, it's incumbent upon us to remove cannabis from the schedule in order to be able to fully look at all the aspects that all of us have talked about here today and better understand them and inform our legislative efforts and our regulatory efforts around them.
Because we should follow the science and the data
course.
when it comes to this substance. Whether it's alcohol or marijuana or psychedelics, we should follow the science.
Absolutely.
Okay, so my last area of inquiry is this, because I come at this from the criminal justice perspective, just because I think mass incarceration has been a devastating effect on our country's resources. Between the time I was law school and mayor of my city, we were building a new jail or prison in our country every 10 days to warehouse 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women on the planet Earth right here in the United States of America. It was a stunning misuse. When I would go to visit prisons, because of my faith tradition, Matthew 25, I would visit people in prison, ask wardens, do these women belong here? They say they need mental health care, they need drug treatment, they need trauma-informed care. This is the worst place. So I have no interest in using marijuana. I have never even drank in my life. No interest in using marijuana whatsoever. I'm concerned about the criminal justice elements of it. Mr. Cook, where you and I think that I can identify one area where we don't agree is that when we passed the First Step Act and we made crack powder cocaine more legal, I believe it's good to go retroactive. And it led to the liberation of thousands of people from prison. And by the way, some of them, a small number of them, committed crimes again. And that's horrible, and we should enforce that. But I do think it's worth the justice system's time and effort to go back and adjust sentences when we know better and do better, and 87 senators did. But I guess I have to get this last piece off my chest is, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. There is a lot of money now pushing for things to happen. And what frustrates me is that the exclusion of communities that have been most persecuted by the prohibition of marijuana are not represented in the billion-dollar industry that continues to grow and have influence in the same way that alcohol does. And so I want to know from you, Mr. Burnett, I'm assuming that you have some understanding of the economics of this, and correct me if I'm wrong if you don't, but do you have concerns that we are about to, besides the criminal justice aspects I'm concerned in, the health and safety access that everybody from Mr. Burnson, Mr. Cook, and others are involved with, from the economic perspective, as you look out at what's happening now, as people are beginning to make tremendous amount of money with only 1% of the businesses being African American, for example, do you have concerns about the way that the economics of this are being conducted and some recommendations going forward?
Yeah, significant concerns. I think that it's imperative, I cannot stress it enough, critical that the strategy that the federal government takes is to allow an incremental process for the engagement around interstate commerce. There are a number of states that are currently working on social equity development programs to help small and minority-owned businesses get a foothold within the cannabis space. As Senator Cotton alluded to, previously was part of a cannabis business as a person of color, largely because there were so few people of color doing it. And the amount of barriers that it takes, and even today in the current marketplace that we exist in, if you're not independently wealthy and have a significant amount of personal cash to be able to weather the current economic environment, your business is going to go under. And so as we move forward, being able to understand the distribution of supply and demand and the protection of the small and minority-owned businesses within nascent states to be able to allow them to flourish is a critical component that we have to keep in mind as we move forward on the federal level. Otherwise, we're going to see the consolidation of wealthy corporate interests take over the cannabis space, and it's going to wash out and prevent all of the harms from the communities that have borne the burden of the criminal justice history of enforcement here in the United States from being able to be equitably reestablished and repaired.
I recently was in Chicago and met with a bunch of African-American men, sadly there were not minority women present, who got licenses, but were telling me horrific stories about mortgaging their homes, selling everything they could just to try to get these businesses open, and still not being able to access the capital systems, despite trying to talk to credit unions and banks. Nobody could do for them what they needed to be done, and they were getting tremendous offers from these national business people to either buy them out entirely, offer them usury rates, or use them as a showpiece to hide behind where the real capital and profit could be made by the wealthier interests. Is that your experience as well?
That is my direct experience. I've been that person sitting in the bank asking for the loans, all of that sort of stuff, been offered the same, by the same multinational large corporations, the opportunity to be able to be bought out of a license. All of that's happening currently. And so as we go forward, there are tremendous tools and abilities within the federal government, and the ability to be able to effectively regulate and prevent regulatory capture of the cannabis space and commercial consolidation of the space is well within the purview of the United States federal government. We have all the tools necessary to be able to create a environment in which we can protect public health, learn the lessons of tobacco and alcohol, and ensure that the economic benefits of this go evenly across.
So is this too simplistic? By not allowing something like safe banking and the opening of the banking rules, we're actually creating a reality by constricting it that this is going to be a business that's going to move forward because states are moving, that's going to allow the people that have resources, already have wealth and access to get the opportunities, and people from lower income backgrounds with criminal past marijuana convictions or what have you, to really get entirely squeezed out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, the need for, legislation like the Safe Banking Act is clear, right? That need is there. But insofar as we're going to do this in a manner that restores pays homage to and ensures that those who have been most harmed by the criminal prohibition of cannabis federally and, everywhere else in the country at the state and local level are able to participate, then we should do it comprehensively and thoughtfully.
So let me say in conclusion, I thank you to every single person on this panel, every single one of you, and my judgment means little, but have this earnest desire to make sure our nation remains safe, secure, fair, and I'm grateful that you all would come and give your testimony. I think there is wisdom in all the testimonies that were put forward and a lot for us to learn. I want to tell you that not only that your testimony today is really important, but I want to let you know that the members of the subcommittee can put questions in for the record and that they're due a week from today, August 2nd at 5 p.m. I would really appreciate it if you all, I know this is that you all have day jobs, but if, to the extent that you can give thorough answers to be a part of the record, it does make a difference. It does really help, and I would ask you for doing that. And in the meantime, thank you. I know this is a robust discussion going on, a national conversation, and I know you all have made valuable contributions on both sides. Every one of you have given me and my team even more to think about. And so, final thank you to my colleague, Tom Cotton, for his leadership and contributions for the subcommittee as well. And with that, I am going to let this hearing be adjourned. Thank you.